Picture your living room in June 1967. Everything on the television is a shade of slate, charcoal, or ash. The world is strictly monochrome. Grey faces reading grey news, grey cowboys riding grey horses across grey deserts, grey comedians telling jokes in grey studios. You've never known anything different. Television has always been black and white, and you've accepted it the same way you accept rain or Monday mornings. Then July 1st, 1967 arrives. Wimbledon is on. You're watching at a friend's house, or you're one of the lucky 500 families in the entire country who've actually bought one of the new sets, and suddenly the center court isn't grey anymore. The grass is green, properly, vividly, almost shockingly green. The players' whites are dazzling, pure, bright enough to make you squint. A tennis ball zips across the screen, and it's yellow, not a shade of grey your brain had been interpreting as yellow for 30 years. The world has turned into color, and nothing will ever be quite the same again. British television had been broadcasting since 1936, when the BBC launched the world's first regular television service from Alexandra Palace in North London. For 30 years, television meant black and white. The pictures were grainy, fuzzy, transmitted in 405 lines, which sounds technical but basically meant the image quality was terrible by modern standards. You didn't talk about color or hue or vibrant tones. You talked about contrast, about whether you could actually make out what was happening through the interference and the fuzz. The picture was never stable. It rolled, it developed horizontal lines that drifted up or down the screen, depending on whether your vertical hold was properly adjusted. Tuning a television in the 1960s was an art form, a skill passed down from father to son like carpentry or fishing. Every set had knobs, those rabbit ear antennas that sat on top of the set, two metal rods that you twist and angle by hand until the picture was as clear as it was going to get, which was never very clear. And if the picture started misbehaving, you didn't call a repairman immediately. You gave it a technical tap, and often miraculously, the picture would stabilize. Nobody knew why it worked. It just did. Every family had their own technique, their preferred spot to hit, for bringing the television back into cooperation. The television itself was a piece of furniture as much as an appliance. It sat in the corner of the living room, usually diagonal to maximize viewing angles, housed in a wooden cabinet with doors that you could close when it wasn't in use, because having a bare screen visible was considered unsightly. Color television had existed since the early 1950s in America. NBC had been broadcasting in color since 1954. But Britain, being Britain, took its time. The technology was expensive, unproven, complicated. The BBC, funded by license fees rather than advertising, was cautious about spending money on something the public might not want. And the government, which controlled broadcasting policy, wasn't sure Britain needed color television at all. Wasn't black and white good enough? Did people really care that much? There was also the technical problem of which system to use. America used NTSC, which pessimists said stood for never twice the same color, because the picture quality was inconsistent. Britain hesitated for years, running trials, debating in Parliament, while the rest of the world moved ahead. But by the mid-1960s, the pressure was building. America had color. France was planning color. Germany was developing color. Britain, which had pioneered television broadcasting, was falling behind. The decision was finally made, and BBC Two, the newest channel which had launched in 1964, would become the first regular color service in Europe. Not BBC One, which was the main channel, but BBC Two, which was still finding its audience. The announcement was made, and the date was set. July 1st, 1967. Wimbledon would be broadcast in color for the first time in British history. Newspapers ran articles explaining the technology, showing diagrams of how color television worked, interviewing engineers who promised this was the future. Manufacturers like Philips, Pye, Bush, Ferguson scrambled to produce sets, knowing there would be demand but not knowing how much. Production was limited by component availability because a color television was an expensive precision instrument that absolutely had to work perfectly. Television rental shops like Radio Rentals and DER ordered stock and prepared for the rush. And the BBC planned their programming carefully, choosing events and shows that would look spectacular in color, that would justify the expense and convince the public that this wasn't just a gimmick. July 1st, 1967. Wimbledon, the most British of sporting events. At 2 p.m., David Attenborough, not yet the legendary natural history presenter he would become, but the controller of BBC Two, appeared on screen to introduce the broadcast. He was in black and white for most viewers, because most viewers didn't have color sets. They were watching this historic announcement in the same monochrome they'd always watched television, but Attenborough's words promised something different. Today, he said, you will see Wimbledon as it truly looks. Today, television becomes real. And then it happened. The camera cut to center court and the world changed. The grass was green, not gray. Not a shade you had to imagine was green, but actually, genuinely, unmistakably green. The umpire's chair was green, the net was white, the crowd wore colors, reds and blues and yellows and patterns that had always been there but had been invisible, hidden by the limitations of black and white broadcasting. And when the players walked onto the court in their pristine whites, when the camera caught them against that vivid green backdrop, it was like seeing tennis for the first time. The ball was yellow, bright tennis ball yellow. Watching tennis in color wasn't just prettier, it was easier, more comprehensible, more real. You could see sweat on the players' faces, you could see details that had always existed but had been lost in the gray blur of analog television. The strawberries being eaten by spectators were actually red. The advertisements around the court had colors, logos had meaning again. But here's the thing that makes this moment both historic and absurd. Only about 500 families in the entire United Kingdom actually owned color television sets. Out of a population of 55 million, out of millions of households with televisions, only 500 had color. The rest watched this historic color broadcast in black and white. They listened to commentators describe how amazing the colors looked, how vibrant and clear and real everything seemed, while watching the same gray images they'd always watched. It was like being told about a party you weren't invited to, being described the feast while eating bread and water. People crowded around shop windows, television rental shops, and department stores like Curry's. The shops knew this would happen and prepared, putting their best sets in the windows, tuning them perfectly, adjusting the color balance so the grass looked its absolute greenest, drawing crowds of onlookers who stood on the pavement watching tennis through glass. Children pressed their faces against the glass, mesmerized. Adults stood transfixed, some for hours, watching an entire match through a shop window because this was their only chance to see what color television actually looked like. Because color televisions were breathtakingly expensive. A decent color set in 1967 cost around $300. To put that in perspective, the average annual wage was about $600. It was the same as buying a small car. It was the kind of purchase you saved up for, discussed with your spouse, lost sleep over. Most families simply couldn't afford it. And even if you could afford the initial purchase, there were the higher electricity bills because color sets used more power. And starting in 1968, the new color television license, which cost $10 compared to $500 for black and white. That license fee created a visible class divide. It was proof you'd made it financially. So most families didn't buy. They rented. Renting made sense because televisions broke. Constantly. These weren't solid-state electronics. They weren't reliable circuits. A color television might have 30 or 40 valves, and any one of them could fail at any time. The picture would develop a weird tint, everything too red or too blue, or the color would disappear entirely, leaving you with expensive monochrome. Or one color would dominate, turning faces green or landscapes purple. When that happened, you didn't panic, you called the man. Every rental company had engineers with toolboxes full of spare valves, capacitors, and mysterious electronic components. They'd come to your house, usually within a day or two, and they'd take the back off the television. This was terrifying to watch because the inside was all exposed wires and glowing glass. Tubes and warnings about high voltage enough to kill you if you touched the wrong component. Children were warned never, ever to touch the back of the television, never to poke anything, because electricity inside was deadly. The engineer would poke around with a meter, testing voltages, checking connections, identifying the failed valve. He might spend an hour carefully adjusting tiny magnets around the tube, getting the colors to line up properly, making sure white was actually white and not white with a red edge. And you'd pay nothing extra because that was included in your rental fee. Owning a color television, whether bought or rented, was a status symbol. The sets came with a small sticker that you were supposed to put in the corner of the screen. People displayed these stickers proudly, positioning them where they'd be visible through the front window so neighbors and passers-by would know. The sticker was as much a part of the television as the screen itself. Some people left them on for years, even after color televisions became common because removing the sticker meant admitting it wasn't special anymore. The sets themselves were massive pieces of furniture. A 1967 color television was a substantial object designed to look like respectable furniture because that's what they were. They weighed 100 pounds or more. Moving one required at least 2 people and careful planning. And they took forever to warm up. You didn't just press a button and have an instant picture as you do now. You turned on the set and waited. First, you'd hear a click, then a hum as the transformer started working. Then the valves would begin warming up, glowing orange inside the cabinet, generating heat. You could smell it, that distinctive scent of warm dust on glass, of electronic components heating up, of ozone from the high voltage. It was the smell of television, a smell that meant evening entertainment was about to begin. And gradually, over 30 seconds or more, the picture would appear. First, a dot of light in the center of the screen, expanding outward, then fuzzy colors resolving into an image. And then there was the snooker problem. Snooker became one of color television's most popular programs. The BBC launched Pot Black in 1969, a snooker tournament specifically designed to showcase color broadcasting. Watching snooker in color actually made sense. You could see which ball was which, could follow the strategy, could appreciate the skill involved. Color television arrived right at the perfect cultural moment. 1967 was the summer of love, the peak of the psychedelic era, when color mattered to youth culture in ways it never had before. Carnaby Street fashion was all about bright, clashing colors. Album covers were designed as colorful art pieces meant to be stared at, and suddenly all of this could be broadcast into living rooms. Pop music shows like Top of the Pops became opportunities to showcase the latest fashions, the wildest colors, the most outrageous visual styles. The generation gap became partly about color. Young people embraced it, while older people found it inappropriate. "It's too bright," parents would complain, turning down the color saturation until the picture looked almost like black and white anyway. The transition from black and white to color took years. BBC One and ITV didn't begin regular color broadcasting until 1969. By the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, color television ownership exploded. Prices dropped slowly. A color set that cost $300 in 1967 might cost $250 by 1970, $200 by 1973, and rental options became more affordable. By 1976, the majority of households had color sets, and by 1980, black and white television was essentially extinct. You could still buy monochrome sets, still watch everything in black and white if you wanted, but almost nobody did. The last black and white license was issued in the 1980s to someone who presumably kept their old set out of stubbornness or nostalgia. Color had won completely and permanently. The impact on how we understood the world was a big change. News in color felt more real, more immediate, more visceral. Footage from wars, from disasters, from political events, seeing them in color made them harder to dismiss as distant or abstract. The Vietnam War, broadcast in color into American homes, became unbearable in ways black and white footage never was. Blood was red, jungles were green, destruction was real. Britain's news didn't show quite the same graphic content, but the principle held. Color made everything more real. Nature documentaries, which had always been popular, became stunning when broadcast in color. David Attenborough's early programs showed animals and landscapes in their true colors, revealing details and beauty that black and white had hidden. The blue of a tropical ocean, the colors of birds and insects and coral reefs, all of it visible for the first time to audiences who'd only imagined what these things might look like. Sports became more watchable, more exciting, and easier to follow. Football teams were no longer just light shirts versus dark shirts. Cricket, which had always looked like white figures on a green background, gained texture and detail. Horse racing made sense. You could identify horses by the jockey's silks, could follow your pick through the race. Color transformed sports broadcasting from radio with pictures into something genuinely visual, but something was lost too. Black and white television had a certain quality, a certain atmosphere that color eliminated. Film noir, classic movies, the BBC's atmospheric dramas, they'd been designed for black and white, composed with shadow and contrast in mind. Color made them different, sometimes better, sometimes just different. The mood changed. The artistic choices that worked in monochrome didn't always work in color. Some directors continued shooting in black and white into the color era, insisting that their vision required it, that color would be a distraction rather than an enhancement. They were mostly ignored or considered eccentric, but they had a point. By the end of the 60s, there was no going back. We'd seen the world in Technicolor, and the gray years were gone for good. Do you remember the first thing you saw in color? Was it the snooker or perhaps the 1969 moon landing? Share your memories in the comments.